All right, so what's it called? We have a fantastic guest today. We're gonna do the introduction in a second, but we were talking off air about Hugo's alcoholism. Ben, you were telling me something very important.
Well, first of all, the most important thing everyone needs to realize is Ugopnik in real life walks around with the mask on. It's
Exactly.
crazy. I blew my mind. I saw him walking down the street in China, and I was like, "Is this guy gonna rob me?" And then I was like, "Whoa, that's Ugopnik." And then people were asking us. They were like, "Wait a second, why doesn't the police tell you to take off the mask?" And Ugopnik said in fluent Chinese, he said, "Comrades, you have to understand, I'm Ugopnik." And they all said, "Oh, Ugopnik, you can keep the mask on. It's okay."
Exactly. Right. He's well known. His direct
Comrade
line.
Ugopnik.
Dude, the only reason he was not intimidated is because he literally has 7 security special forces Chinese
Around him at
officers
all times.
around him at all times. We
When they all
weren't
have masks
planning
on,
on
too.
meeting up. We weren't planning on meeting up. I would be too intimidated by Ben's towering intellect, and of course, somebody so high up in the Chinese Communist Party, I can't just reach out like this. But I was just walking down a
It's
city.
CPC. The official
Okay.
name is the Communist Party of China. Let's get it right.
Okay, you English-speaking motherfuckers. I'm going to call it KPK, Komunistička partija Kine. Okay, I'm kidding. And it was very surprising that in a city that's like 13, 14 times bigger than New York, a masked man and a man with a security detail of 7, 8 people just randomly met, and we were like, "Oh, you're the YouTube guy," and he's like, "Oh, you're the podcast guy," and I was like, "Very good, very good. It's a pleasure to meet you, brother." And then he spoke again in perfect Chinese. It was incredible. It was wow.
And then we had lunch. And do you want to share that story? It was a very good lunch.
He wanted to test my true working class resolve. Okay, he promised me we were going for Beijing duck and caviar and champagne and so on. And then he brings me to a place that specializes in frog. And he's like, "So they have 10 different types of frog here," and he just orders dum 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 dum, and they just start bringing out these frogs and frogs and frogs. But little did he know, I grew up eating frog. Okay, I'm secretly Chinese. Some people say that they're caught in their Chinese century, or what was it? You caught me at a very Chinese time of my life. My entire life was a Chinese time of my life. But jokes aside, no, it was actually very tasty.
Yugoslavia
It was
and China,
fantastic.
we're always brothers.
1,000,000%.
To a point.
Listen, spending 7, 8 days in China taught me that they are unironically I started agreeing with the most fucked up Nazi propaganda about Slavic people, which is like, oh, they're not like the normal Western whites. They're barbaric Asiatic hordes. And then I go to China. I'm like, Jesus Christ, Chinese people are super fucking similar to Slavic people. Maybe we are Asiatic hordes, but in all the best ways. The opposite of what the Nazis intend to say. We're like, God bless, we're not like Westerners. Let's fucking go. I'm walking through China, motherfucker smoking cigarettes, drinking fucking beer, fucking farting, be like, yo, bro. You walk into
Do they have the stomach showing, or it's too cold?
It was too cold. It was too cold. It was too cold. The most Balkan thing I've seen in China, and it genuinely warmed my heart, was walking in a restaurant, like a working class chill restaurant in like a smaller neighborhood, and it just at the entrance it has a massive no smoking sign. And you walk in, and of course there's like 3, 4 uncles.
Everyone's
just fucking
smoking.
puffing it up, fucking cling with the Chinese rakia and shit, and fucking shouting about politics or something. I'm like, I'm home.
Dude,
I am home. I am home.
I've seen that so many times. Basically in China, if you see a no smoking sign, that means smoke here.
Yeah.
I've seen guys, I'm not joking, I've seen guys smoking in front of no smoking signs in airports.
I love it.
It's the
No
only
way.
country. Yeah.
I love it. I'm surprised they don't do it on the plane. I know Hugo's gonna jump on that opportunity if he gets.
I have always said if there is every airline should have one plane that's charged
Just
out
for
of their
smokers.
fucking mind just for smokers. Smokers would pay. Non-smokers would pay. You just puffing all the way up there is absolutely absurd.
I love it.
But jokes aside, Ben, it was a genuine pleasure meeting you in real life, meeting your lovely wife, you meeting my fiance, and thank you for taking the time. That's number one. And number two, I'm fucking jealous that you get to live in China, you motherfucker.
I love it for you. I was gonna say
It was a great lunch. I hope you like the duck. And I have to say, before we were recording, we were talking about how normally these guys record at 9 at night, and that's a great time because Hugo can have a few beers before they record. But then again, we're recording in the afternoon now, and when we got lunch, he was already drinking anyway. So, but in his defense, he was on vacation. So.
Yeah, it's not a vacation thing, I promise you.
Okay, like, can I admit to something? Today's low-key my day off because I'm not streaming and I'm drinking coffee. There's like 2 splashes of whiskey in it.
Okay, it's fine.
Okay,
it's the Yugoslavia cup. It's the German.
It's only 70-30. 70% alcohol, 30% coffee.
Of course. I'm not a savage. I'm not a savage. Dude. I drink water like once a week, in the shower when it accidentally goes into my mouth. That's the entire hydration.
It's raining outside.
Yeah, I'll get you down that pipeline one day. Don't worry.
And by the way, before we really start here, I have to say, Yugobnik, you were talking about how you didn't want to racially profile yourself, but I mean, come on, man. I think you're wearing a tracksuit right now. Come on.
It is. It is my official tracksuit. Okay, this is not just a random tracksuit. This is my formal tracksuit. Okay, it's you see Lacoste, sponsored by.
This is the wedding, and we need to go beat somebody up, some specific person up.
Yeah, I'm trying out different tracksuits for my wedding next year, and usually you wear like your fancy tracksuit for like formal occasions such as this interview to the wedding, and then for burials. Okay, those 3 things we do in.
The black tracksuits for the funeral.
For the funeral, usually, yes. But depends. If you didn't like the guy and you want to symbolize, show everyone that you didn't like them through your attire, you wear something bombastic like a red tracksuit. And then your partner, if she's a lady, she also wears like a red dress, and then you match. You ever seen that meme? Yes. Typical Balkan couple, and it's Shrek, and like a 10 out of 10. That is true, but in reverse.
It's the girl from Tangled or whatever.
Yeah.
Or Peter Griffin.
Oh my God. If you wear a white tracksuit to your wedding, that would just be glorious. You have to get photos of that. Perfect. Yeah. I mean, with the mask, a white mask. Oh man.
If you do it, I'll wear a white mask.
That would be low key KKK white a little bit, like, but would work. All white with a white mask. But yeah. I feel like it would like borderline. Like I'm doing a racial caricature of my people. Sometimes I even get flack. Like people are like, "Oh, you fucking you speak with accent and you wear tracksuit and you like drink and smoke cigarette. Why are you LARPing stereotype?" I'm like, "But that's just me, you fucking cunt." Like what? I can't help being.
I do actively enjoy these things. Yes,
I do. Like it's normal. No more smoking. Except for fucking China. But yes, I still have a couple of packs that I'm just puffing away. I'm unironically using incredibly high quality Chinese cigarettes that I imported. As a means to preach socialism to people. I sit at a bar or at a restaurant or like an event, a birthday party or a wedding and so on, which I've had all of those since I've been back from China like 2 weeks ago. And I whip out the Chinese cigarettes, I put them on the table, and everybody's like, "What the fuck is this? I've never seen this pack of cigarettes. Where did you get them from?" And then I'm like, "Oh, I got them from the People's Republic of China." And then I open the thing and I'm like, "Smell." And they smell like, "Oh my God, this actually smells like cigarettes, not like this chemical shit that we have here." And I'm like, "Yes, because in the Socialist Project, they properly manage quality, unlike these degenerative bourgeois societies that we find ourselves in." And they're like, "Oh, tell me more about this working class society, my friend. Do I get good cigarettes?" I'm like, "Yes, everybody would get good cigarettes. Here, this is proof. Do you see Tiananmen Square on this? This is proof." And it works. Like I'm not even kidding. They're like, they actually want to hear it. It's
the what's it called? The during the build-up phase prior to the the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in the or the precursors
Communist Party of China.
Sorry. It's like what's it called? The not layman's. Well, everybody. Yeah. You know what I mean. I notice actually, funnily enough, I always default to CPC when I say the acronym, right? But when I say it outright, I don't know, it flows off the tongue more easier. Anyways, what I was gonna say was during the build-up, they would have the rations. Each soldier would have the rations or whatever else, and in their rations they had specifically cigarettes, and it was a very specific brand or form of cigarettes from a part of China. I don't remember exactly where. But that's interesting to note. So I think.
Well, fun fact. there's so many misconceptions about China after the reform that started in 1978. I mean, one fun fact is that in China, 55% of all of the assets owned by companies belong to state-owned enterprises. So over half of all of the all of the company's assets are publicly owned. And among the many different state-owned enterprises, SOEs in China, which are dominating, the commanding heights of the economy, including finance, telecommunications, infrastructure, heavy industry, etc. Fun fact: one of the important SOEs is the state-owned tobacco company.
Of course.
So, you were semi-jokingly talking about socialism and cigarettes, but I mean, I'm not a big fan. I think cigarettes are awful. No offense, they kill you. But China does technically have socialist cigarettes from a state-owned enterprise.
Right. There you go. Hey, you don't waste your breath, Ben. I've tried with this man. To his credit, he doesn't smoke anymore, and he does not vape either. He does a bit of the zins and every once in a while, so I'm very proud of him. He's done fantastically.
Thank you.
Ben,
thank you.
Aside from how surreal it is to have you on camera, it's the same setup as when you do the geopolitical economy report. I love that. You and I have developed, unbeknownst to you and I have developed a very intimate relationship, and that is that for some reason your videos I tend to watch very intently, almost exclusively when I shower. I don't know why that is. It's almost like a little ritual now. I have like a little thing, a carrier thing that I put my phone in. And I'm sitting there, I'm blathering my hair up.
Talk about harassment. Should I call HR? Should I call HR? Is this an HR moment right now? Is this
exactly right?
Hey, Chad, is this an HR moment? What?
You need to be thoroughly made aware of the fact that I am always in the nude when you're, except for right now.
If we're sharing our secrets, I listen to podcasts when I take a shower, but typically I listen to really boring finance podcasts that don't have any video, because if I'm going to watch a Hakeem video, I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to see the graphics and all the work you put into it. So, I'm going to wait till I'm out of the shower to watch your great videos. But I always do watch all of them. And I wish I could watch more Ugopnik videos, but we talked about that.
He barely puts them out.
We'll have more soon.
I stream, goddammit. Yep.
I know, I'm teasing you, Heavy.
I know.
All right, let's get into the main content.
Wait, we're talking about something else today?
Yeah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Deprogram. Today, we have a returning champion of the show, a one-man media enterprise machine, journalist, political economist, and American who refuses to live in America, dear friend of the show, Ben Norton. Welcome, Ben. Before we begin, could you please introduce yourself to the cave-dwelling members of our audience that might not know about you, and share a bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, as a fellow cave dweller in an undisclosed location in rural China, and I prefer the term ex-American. Thanks for having me, comrades. It's always a pleasure. One of my favorite shows. I always love to be deprogrammed by you guys.
I love it.
You did the thing. I love that you did the thing. That's
he said it. I'm gonna bust.
It was like a snake eating its own ass. Oh, halab, these nuts.
I can now clip another hole in my card, and I think 2 more times, and you have to give me equity ownership in your podcast.
Absolutely, you're more than welcome.
Oh, fucking legendary. Okay, so Ben. Is the United States going to attack Venezuela? And if they are, what's the American military strategy going to be? Talk about what was it that people of color have to do when interacting with white people that don't know? Code switch? What was it? Hakeem, help me out. Switch code? What was it? Yeah, I just code switched the entire podcast. We eat frogs and drink beer too. So World War III, what the fuck?
Possibly.
Jokes aside, it's a very serious topic. So please, Ben, take it away.
Well, the sad answer is that the U.S. is already attacking Venezuela. The question is if they'll escalate further. And unfortunately, I do think they will escalate further. The question, of course, on everyone's mind is what would that escalation look like? Now, I personally don't think that they'll put troops on the ground in the sense of like a conventional invasion like the Iraq War. But there are reports that Trump is thinking of sending special operations forces to try to assassinate President Nicolas Maduro. That's a very real possibility. The U.S. already backed a failed invasion of Venezuela. This is often forgotten. People kind of jokingly called it Bay of Piglets. And that was in 2020. So back in 2019, Trump, in his first term, started a coup attempt in Venezuela. There have been many coup attempts in Venezuela, including in 2002, there was a briefly successful coup against Hugo Chavez. And then there were coup attempts in 2014, a violent coup attempt backed by the U.S., another violent coup attempt in 2017. And then in 2019, there was this coup attempt with Juan Guaido, where, they had this little known right-wing opposition politician named Juan Guaido, who was backed by the U.S. He went out in the street and declared himself so-called interim president, despite the fact that he never participated in a presidential election. The U.S. appointed him the so-called interim president. The U.S. pressured a few dozen countries to also recognize him. At the peak, there were around 30 to 40 countries recognizing him. But again, there are 193 UN member states, so the vast majority of countries never recognized him. They always continued recognizing the constitutional president, Maduro.
Yeah.
So that coup attempt failed. But when the coup attempt was already dying, in 2020, there was an attempted invasion of Venezuela that was called Operation Gideon. And this was led by two former U.S. Army Special Operations Forces, Green Berets. And the operation was overseen by another Green Beret named Jordan Goudreau, who was working with the Trump administration. He later admitted this in lawsuits because, if you work for the U.S. empire and you fail, then they abandon you. This is what they always do. They stab you in the back. So this guy, Jordan Goudreau, was working with the CIA. He admitted that. He was working with the Trump administration, and then it failed, and they just abandoned him with plausible deniability, saying they didn't know who this guy was. So he sued them, being like, you owe me millions of dollars. So what this guy was doing is he was training mercenaries in northern Colombia, and then they went in a boat into Venezuela, and some fishermen, socialist fishermen from a union who supported the government, they were Chavistas, they saw these guys being led by two obvious, I guess maybe they had masks on, but they probably, it was very strange. They were like, who are these guys invading? And then they told the security forces, and then they arrested them. And there's this famous photo of these two random white guys, these Green Berets, who were being held by these Venezuelan officers. So there was an attempted invasion, but of course now we're talking about something much more extreme, where there are reports that there are around 10,000 U.S. troops now in the region, about half of them in Puerto Rico, which shows how the U.S. has colonized Puerto Rico and has used this as this kind of colonial outpost to attack other countries in the region. And the U.S. has at least 6 naval vessels, warships surrounding Venezuela. The U.S. has already killed at least 60 people, and these are innocent people. There has been no evidence whatsoever that they're so-called drug traffickers. And there have been reports, even in Politico, a mainstream outlet, in which the former Department of Defense, now much more accurately called the Department of War, admitted they actually have no evidence proving these people are trafficking drugs, in scare quotes. And there are reports that these boats don't even have enough gasoline to make it to the U.S. as if they were, it's absurd. And then on these boats, there are 10 people that are killed. Why would 10 people be on a drug boat? They want to minimize the number of people to maximize the amount of drugs. It's so stupid. It's all a completely fake narrative, but it's part of this new WMD's myth, right? The new weapons of mass destruction myth, which is trying to create this narrative that supposedly Nicolas Maduro is not a real president. Instead, the U.S. narrative is that he's the leader of a drug cartel, in scare quotes, called the Cartel de los Soles, the Suns Cartel, which does not exist, by the way. Numerous independent experts on the drug trade have investigated, and they have said that there's no evidence. The U.S. government literally invented this. And if you look at the so-called evidence presented by the U.S. government, which is all fabricated, you look at the list they have of the supposed leaders. What a coincidence. All of the leaders of this fake drug cartel just so happen to be the leaders of the Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan military. So they're using the same excuse that was actually used in 1989 when the U.S. invaded Panama, and they overthrew the Panamanian government, killed many civilians. I mean, I've been to Panama many times because a lot of flights in Latin America go through Panama. And there are still poor parts of Panama City where, I mean, there was not that much rebuilding. These are still very poor parts of the city that have just been abandoned by the, neoliberal government. I mean, so the U.S. devastated Panama, and then they kidnapped the leader of Panama, Manuel Noriega, who ironically had been a longtime CIA asset. So the U.S. knew that he was a drug trader because he was trafficking drugs for the CIA for a long time until he became the leader of Panama. Yeah, I mean, like Saddam Hussein was also working with the CIA in the original Ba'ath coup. So, I mean, like, there are so many examples of this throughout history. But anyway, the point is that's the kind of blueprint, is that the U.S. wants to launch some kind of attack in Venezuela, kidnap President Maduro, like they kidnapped Noriega, and then imprison him in the U.S., have a kangaroo court, a fake trial on these bogus charges. I mean, it's completely absurd. And there have been reports, including in the New York Times, saying that there are kind of 3 options being considered. One of them I already talked about, which is that it would be an attack by special operations forces to try to kidnap and or assassinate President Maduro. That's one option. The other option being considered is bombing Caracas with U.S. planes or sending missiles from U.S. ships. Or another option is they're going to try to just continue to do like a naval blockade in Venezuela, massively increase the pressure, try to cause a coup inside Venezuela, which I don't think will work, but try to cause a coup, try to make Maduro so afraid that they force him to flee is what they claim will happen. But I don't think that's going to happen.
100%.
It's so interesting that they decide to go this route of the drug trafficking or like the war on drugs stuff, which is so early 2000s dated, if that makes sense. Like the craze around drugs was like a late 80s, 90s, and then early 2000s, and then just kind of got swept away into the war on terrorism stuff. But they can't do the terrorism charge on Venezuela. I don't know, it's because I guess they're not Muslim. I think that's the thinking, that they couldn't choose that excuse. Pretty much. So they decided to go drug trafficking. Thing is, the vast majority of Americans, I don't think give a shit. I don't think they care. And it kind of, at least because I'm not American, but my perusing of American media, you don't see, like for example, if you were to try to see how much coverage there is of quote unquote terrorist attacks or these developments in quote unquote terrorist countries or terrorist movements from what they claim Hezbollah or what's going on in Yemen or Iran supporting certain things, whatever else, right? There's so much of it. There's probably an article every day or every other day about something, especially when Israel is in the crosshairs. But when you look at the drug trafficking thing, it's always like a beeline to, like the Trump administration wants to, or the U.S. government wants to start beef with them, right? New beef, I guess. Something that is actually kind of refreshing, which is very strange for American media. You also see that they mention every once in a while that, there was a coup attempt, an American coup attempt of the Venezuelan government before. But this time is different. No. This time the American government claimed that there's drug trafficking happening.
It's refreshing that we also see like mainstream reporting that unironically says Trump has been lobbied to do a coup in Venezuela ever since his first term, but he quote unquote never liked the pitch. And what they're trying to say with this is, Maduro evil dictator. And he's like, is that going to get me votes? That doesn't sound that good. And finally, they created narco-terrorist dictator. And he's like, drugs. That feels good. That feels good. I think they're going to, the chuds will be able to eat this up. It's like toddlers playing with nuclear missiles. And I know this is an absurd cliche, but when you have, again, mainstream American journalists being like, the main reason he said yes, and we have sources in the intelligence community of the United States, the main reason he said yes because he was like, I love this hashtag. Hashtag narco-terrorist. Narco. I like the narco spin. Let's do it. It's so absurd.
I agree with everything you guys said except one little thing that Hakeem said, which is that you said they can no longer do the war on terror. Well, actually, what they're doing is they're combining the bogus war on drugs with the bogus war on terror together, right?
Yeah.
Because Trump actually, in an executive order, he recognized these drug cartels as so-called terrorist organizations. So they literally are bringing back these two completely bogus failed wars. Yeah. And of course, if you know anything about the war on drugs, you know that the U.S. has always been allied with the worst drug dealers in Latin America. And the people who were working with the U.S. to wage the so-called war on drugs were themselves complicit in drug trafficking. So famously, in Colombia, the most powerful Colombian politician, the right-wing, far-right oligarch Álvaro Uribe, is a notorious drug trafficker. U.S. intelligence documents admit that, declassified documents admit that he worked closely with Pablo Escobar. They were friends. He worked closely with the Medellin cartel, one of the most famous cartels on earth. And he was a close ally of the Bush administration at the peak of the so-called war on drugs in Colombia. And he oversaw the killing of at least 5,000 civilians in what was known as the false positive scandal, where the government, the Colombian military, with the backing of the U.S. government, billions of dollars through Plan Colombia, the Colombian military killed over 5,000 people, innocent people, and then they dressed them up in the uniforms of revolutionary guerrilla groups like the FARC, which is a socialist guerrilla group. So, I mean, this is one of the allies of the U.S. in the war on drugs, one of the worst drug traffickers. And then in Mexico, the right-wing president at that time, at the peak of the war on drugs, who started the war on drugs in Mexico that caused literally hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's been a horrible bloodbath in Mexico. And the right-wing leader who started that in alliance with the U.S. was Felipe Calderón, and the head of his security was a drug trafficker, Garcia Luna, who was prosecuted for being a drug trafficker. So literally the people who were waging the war on drugs were the drug traffickers, just like the U.S., its so-called war on terrorism. The U.S. is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. And what brings this all full circle, Hakeem, is, you were talking about how the U.S. basically considers Muslims who fight back against the empire so-called terrorists. Well, recently the U.S. Senate had a hearing in which they talked for like hours. They made these fake accusations that Hezbollah is active all over Venezuela.
Yeah, exactly right.
That was incredible.
And then, I mean, that's not new. They've been saying that for years. But I've been following this stuff for a long time, for over a decade. But the first time I ever heard this, they also claimed that now Hezbollah is active in Colombia under the first ever left-wing president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who, by the way, was a member of an armed guerrilla, a socialist revolutionary guerrilla group that later demilitarized and they became a political party. So, I mean, actually, Petro is very impressive. I mean, he did come through, bourgeois elections, but he never really totally abandoned his revolutionary past. And the U.S. has also been trying to destabilize him. Trump just imposed sanctions on him on completely fake, bogus claims that he's involved in drug trafficking. Trump also imposed sanctions on his family and is threatening his family. And now they claim that Hezbollah is magically operating in Colombia as well. So, I mean, they're not creative in any way. They're bringing back the same old excuses and just combining them together this time.
Literally WMDs part 2 with some coke sprinkled on top. And you've already covered this exceptionally eloquently. What the direction I want to take it in is something that Hakeem mentioned. And I genuinely, I have the worst, most borderline anti-intellectual way of surveying average American opinions and stuff, and that's TikTok comments and TikToks. And it's been incredible to see a true divide between, let's say, two types of Americans and their reaction to this consent manufacturing machine for, pretty much deploying all over South America because drugs and terrorism combined, very bad, where a massive portion completely swallows it, completely swallows the same argumentation that was used. Oh, we should go into Hakim's country because Saddam Hussein this, Saddam Hussein that, and they're selling drugs the same way. Oh, trust me, there are WMDs in there. But then there's a massive part of the population that's unironically just pointing this out. They're like, guys, this is just WMDs too. Like it's borderline a cliche at this point. Like it's very, very, very obvious. So what I'm trying to ask is, do you think? I guess it's a two-parter. Do you think that this pitch can work on Americans?
Have the appetite for this?
Yeah, and now that's number one. And number two, at this point, with America at this stage of its both decline but also fascist incline. do they even need consent to do this type of shit?
Well, no, of course not. The U.S. never,
Yeah.
the U.S. government never needs consent, which is why in recent years they've put even less effort into doing like this half-assed
Yeah.
manufacturing consent. It's just so bad. I just got up my phone really briefly here. There was a poll that was published by YouGov because the U.S. won't do it, so the U.K. did it. YouGov, and they polled people in the U.S. And they asked them their opinions about this. This was in October, and they found that a plurality of Americans oppose a U.S. military intervention. 46% oppose a U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. Only 18% support it. 36% are not sure. And sorry, that was the poll asking if they would support using military force to overthrow President Maduro. Even more, a slight majority oppose a U.S. military invasion of Venezuela. 55%.
Yeah.
A bit over half oppose a U.S. military invasion of Venezuela. So this is not popular, but again, the U.S. government is not a democracy; it's an oligarchy.
The U.S. government isn't popular either.
Yeah, of course, exactly. So they just do whatever they want because it's an oligarchy, and of course, the Iraq War was a completely illegal war in violation of international law. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, said it was blatantly illegal. No consequences. War in Afghanistan, no consequences. War in Yemen, Syria, Libya, no consequences. So, unfortunately, I mean, international law basically doesn't exist. The U.S. empire does whatever it wants. Popular opinion doesn't matter. So, yeah, I mean, the only way to stop it is the people of Venezuela defending themselves, and they are. I mean, Venezuela has a military. It's not very well equipped, but they are a very nationalist military. And also, there are a lot of Venezuelans who will pick up arms. And I'm not just saying this from, like, I've been to Venezuela multiple times. I speak fluent Spanish. I've been to the barrios. I've been to, like, the very working class areas of Caracas. And I've interviewed people, and I have a lot of Venezuelan friends. And what I always remember a story, like, is always stuck with me, that one time I was in Petare, which is a very working class, relatively impoverished part of Caracas, one of the biggest neighborhoods in all of Latin America. And I was working on a news story and interviewing people. This was in 2019 during the last coup attempt. And I remember specifically a guy, he was like, he invited me into his house and he showed me he had some guns. And he said, if the gringos ever attack us, I will fight. And like, I have friends, we will fight. I swear, I swear to you, this has happened. Now, obviously that's not the majority of Venezuelans, but you don't need the majority to have like a guerrilla war.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the U.S. always vastly underestimates. They believe their own propaganda. They underestimate the support that many of these revolutionary projects have. The only reason that the Venezuelan government has held on is because there still is popular support. I mean, I constantly make this point, but I want to stress it again. Venezuela for over 100 years has been a petrostate. The vast majority of government revenue, for before Hugo Chavez was even born, came from oil. And what happens when countries have a lot of oil or natural resources is economists refer to something called Dutch disease or the resource curse. And that doesn't mean, speaking like a horrible Dutchman. It means that when you have these natural resources, like when the Netherlands discovered natural gas, what happens is that your manufacturing atrophies, your other parts of your economy, the productive sector atrophy, because all you do is just export raw materials, which is why Saudi Arabia and the UAE are trying desperately to diversify their economies, and they find it very hard to do. The UAE is getting involved in like money laundering, like helping money launderers around the world become, like the UAE wants to be the new Switzerland, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's very hard to diversify out of oil and gas. So Venezuela had this issue where their government, over 90% of revenue came from selling oil. The U.S. imposed sanctions and a blockade in Venezuela, preventing Venezuela from exporting its oil. And even more importantly, Venezuela's oil infrastructure, all of the technology, was built using technology from U.S. companies. And they didn't develop, they don't like make drilling equipment and all of this locally in Venezuela. So when the U.S. imposed all these sanctions, Venezuela could no longer import all of the technology and materials needed to fix broken equipment and to upgrade the fixed capital. So that's a significant reason for Venezuela's oil production massively falling to now it's It's been improving. It's now around 1 million barrels of oil a day, but it used to be over two times that, nearly 3 times that. So, but the reason I mention all of this is that if this were Saudi Arabia and the U.S. imposed a blockade on Saudi Arabia, cutting Saudi Arabia out of the international financial system, which is dominated by the U.S., preventing Saudi Arabia from getting access to the dollar system, seizing Saudi Arabia's foreign reserves, including its gold, which the Bank of England still has, billions of dollars of gold they refuse to give back. This is piracy. Saudi Arabia would collapse in a week. There's no way in hell that the Saudi regime would survive years of a blockade like Venezuela has. The reason that Venezuela has survived is because it still has this popular support. And, I've seen it. Like, people, they say, like, they have suffered. It has been very difficult economically. The economy has recovered. When I was there in 2019 and 2020, it was very painful. But they've made it through the hard part. They've been recovering despite the blockade, despite the sanctions. And this is why the U.S. is resorting to attacks militarily, because they've seen that all of the other attempts have failed. And it's why I don't think this pie in the sky idea that the U.S. can force like a military coup, it's not going to happen. They've tried that so many times and it failed every time. The U.S. has bribed so many people in the Venezuelan military. Venezuela is a very nationalist society. There's a lot of popular support. Here's another quick example. The Associated Press just published a story admitting that a U.S. agent was blackmailing and threatening Maduro's main pilot and offered him tens of millions of dollars to fly Maduro to some country where the U.S. would arrest him and imprison him on fake charges. And the pilot said no. He said, "We Venezuelans are not traitors." It's a clear example of this strong, this strong pride in their national project. And then after he said that, the U.S. agent threatened his children by name. According to the AP reported this. So these are the thugs, the criminals in the U.S. government who are using terror tactics, killing people in the Caribbean and the Pacific, killing humble fishermen, terrorizing fishermen, terrorizing the Venezuelan public, and then threatening the children of Venezuelan officials to try to force them to turn against the Venezuelan government, to turn against the revolution. And it has failed for all of these years. That's why they're finally resorting to the military option. Marco Rubio was calling for this back in 2019 and 2020. This was reported in the Spanish media. It was never reported in the English media. There is a lot of stuff reported in the Spanish media that never gets translated that is very revealing. Like, for instance, the Spanish media reported back in 2019 that Juan Guaido, the U.S.-backed coup leader, was working with Colombian drug cartels to cross over the border into Venezuela. So another huge story, another example of how literally a few years ago, the person backed by the U.S. was working with drug cartels, and now they falsely claim that the Venezuelan government is run by drug cartel. I mean, there's no end to the cynicism.
There's something else here that's also very important, very beautifully presented, by the way, and it's that in preparation for a potential American invasion or military action against Venezuela, the Venezuelan government, the rightful Venezuelan government, has decided to create people's militias in Venezuela, where there are now hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I believe, even up to millions, of people who have now been armed by the Venezuelan state and formed and helped to form these militias with, like neighborhood defense units and whatnot. If the government really was that unpopular, and you have all these people who are armed, do you think it would be able to sustain? And Venezuela is not the States, right? Venezuela is not a kind of country that has every single person wiretapped at every single moment with cameras over every street corner, right? So it's not like the thought pattern that they have is just very contradictory, right?
Yeah, well, the U.S. every empire always does this. They always underestimate the popular legitimacy for the government. In the U.S. attack in the Korean War, Vietnam War, the list goes on and on and on, right? In the case of Venezuela, I mean, I mentioned this story. These popular militias have existed for a long time, but they've recently been training more and recruiting more people. And there's been media coverage of this, focused on this, but they're not new, actually. I mentioned, I've seen it personally. I'm not saying I didn't see a lot of guns when I was in Venezuela, but I did. There was this case where this guy, I was interviewing them as a news story, and this guy was like, he wanted to show me as like he was proud of the fact that he was like, we will fight. And by the way,
decked and loaded, Habibi. Venezuela is like Iraq. There's a gun in every household. Surely, I'm sorry. Go on.
I'm not sure about every household, but yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this is actually, I mean, in this case, it's a good thing, but it's actually sometimes a bad thing that Venezuela has had an issue with gun violence for a long time before the Bolivarian Revolution. Also, they share a huge border with Colombia, which has one of the worst drug problems in the entire world. Colombia is responsible for around 2/3 of the global cocaine production, according to UN data. So it's just so funny because the US is pointing at Venezuela, which is responsible for basically no cocaine production. Some cocaine is trafficked through Venezuela, a small percentage. But meanwhile, next door, it's the world's epicenter of cocaine. I mean, Colombia is cocaine land. I mean, no disrespect to the Colombians, but like, come on. I mean, everyone knows that. And according to UN data, and that the US is pointing to Venezuela, it's completely absurd. By the way, another quick detail here. The vast majority of drug deaths in the US, and there have been many, which have been caused by big pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma, who bribed doctors and paid doctors to overprescribe pain medication like OxyContin. And that's why there were dozens of class action lawsuits, including by US states, against Purdue Pharma and the billionaire Sackler family. It was not because of China and Mexico, but that's because of synthetic opioids and fentanyl, which is not coming from Venezuela. 0% of fentanyl comes from Venezuela, according to U.S. government intelligence sources quoted by The Intercept. So, and by Dropsite News as well. They've done good reporting on this, quoting U.S. intelligence sources. So it's completely fake. It's totally bogus. But getting back to this issue of like people fighting, I mean, this is always what happens. In the case of Nicaragua in the 1980s, a country I know very well. I've lived in Nicaragua for several years. And in the case of Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution happened in 1979. The U.S. never thought they would succeed in overthrowing a U.S. puppet right-wing dictator. And then after overthrowing Somoza, the U.S. dictator, they had a revolution. And immediately the U.S. started a terror war with the Contras, which, by the way, in Spanish, literally is contrarrevolucionario, which means counter-revolutionary. That was the name used by the CIA-created death squad. One of the co-leaders of the Contras, who was from one of the richest, most powerful families, the Chamorro family, Edgar Chamorro published an op-ed in the New York Times in which he admitted that the Contras systematically used terrorism against civilians, including torture and sexual violence against women. He said, famously in the New York Times, that they burnt down schools and hospitals faster than the Sandinistas could build them. And he also admitted that he resigned from being a leader of part of the Contras because he did not want to be a CIA puppet. Those were his words. He said that the Contras were CIA puppets. The U.S. thought that by waging this terror war, they could break the back of the Sandinista revolution, that the Nicaraguan people would give in, and they did not. I mean, and still today, the Sandinista revolution is going strong in Nicaragua. So the Sandinistas actually now are stronger than they were in 2018 when there was another coup attempt in Nicaragua backed by the U.S., a very violent coup attempt. And this dovetails in with what I wanted to talk about in Venezuela, because I mentioned that these defense units, the Bolivarian militia, these are like popular communal defense units. One of the reasons they were created is because of the violence by the far right in Venezuela, which has always been very violent. And in the case of the 2014 and 2017 coups, we talked about the 2002 coup, which was in April, and that was a military coup. It was right at the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez was still new. He was in his first term, and it was right before a constitutional referendum. The U.S. was trying to prevent the constitutional referendum. Venezuela has one of the most progressive constitutions on earth. So the U.S. backed this military coup, and they bribed some military officers who overthrew Chavez briefly. But Chavez was so popular that the people of Venezuela flooded the streets and demanded that their democratically elected leader be returned to power. And then other officers in the Venezuelan military rebelled against the coup leaders, and they restored Chavez in power. So that was the early example of the popular support for the revolution. But then fast forward in 2014, so Hugo Chavez died in 2013 in strange circumstances. he contracted a very extreme form of cancer very rapidly, and there are a lot of people in Venezuela who think there was foul play. I've heard that from government officials.
I also
Anyway,
think so, but that's a discussion for
yeah,
another day.
yeah. In 2014, they had an election, and Maduro won the election. Of course, the right-wing opposition leader Capriles claimed that there was fraud without any evidence, but Maduro won. And then there was another violent coup attempt in 2014, and that was the beginning of a tactic that was also used in Nicaragua that were known in Venezuela as the guarimbas and in Nicaragua as the tranques. The guarimbas is basically, it's a term for a very violent barricade. So what they would do is they would get a bunch of trash and like metal,
Scrap and
stuff from like junk from cars and stuff. And they, in the case of Nicaragua, which has a lot of those streets, the roads are made out of like bricks, and you can pull the bricks out. So they would, in both countries, the same tactics, U.S.-backed tactics were used by these U.S.-funded coup plotters, these far-right extremists, these fascists. They would make these violent barricades so people on the street could not drive by, and then they would control traffic, and they would paralyze the economy, prevent anyone from going around, and then they would terrorize people. And when they would do like these, in these barricades, they would do checks. If you drove by, and they would go into your car, and they would ask you for money or drugs or alcohol to bribe them to let you go by. And if they recognized you, they had lists of Chavistas in Venezuela and lists of Sandinistas in Nicaragua. I've heard this from so many, dozens of people have said the same thing. This is not just one person. It's not a media report. People have told me this personally. They had these lists they were sending on social media. You can even find some of the old tweets. And if you were on that list, they would sometimes kill you, or they would kidnap you and videotape them torturing these people. And there are videos you can still find on Twitter of Sandinistas and Chavistas being tortured by these fascists. That was in 2014 and 2017 in Venezuela. And then in 2018, they did the exact same thing in Nicaragua. The U.S. government funded all of this nonsense, all these coup attempts through the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. I've done so much reporting on this, showing all of the money, how it went to all of these groups, like in the U.S., in Nicaragua. It went to this Chamorro Foundation that was funding the coup plotters with money from USAID, so-called aid, and also from the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. They were funding all of this, and you can find all this stuff online, and they still failed. And by the way, they marked houses. I have friends in Nicaragua, Sandinistas, who had to go into hiding for several months during the coup attempt. They could not go home because they were on social media. These coup plotters, known as the golpistas, they would post their address on social media and tell them to go kill these people. And people were killed. Famously, in Managua, symbolically, there's a neighborhood called Barrio Carlos Marx, Karl Marx neighborhood. And there was a Sandinista family whose house was burned down, and they were burned alive. Sandinistas were burned alive by these fascists. And in Venezuela, there were big name, high profile Chavistas who were killed. So the reason I mention all of that is that that's why these popular defense units were created, like the Bolivarian militia in Venezuela, and also the Sandinistas. They also have these defense units. And if you read the propaganda corporate media, they call these the government paramilitaries, in scare quotes. They claim that Maduro has paramilitaries, or Comandante Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua has paramilitaries, in scare quotes. No, these were popular groups created by people in their community to defend themselves against fascist violence during these coup attempts.
Absolutely. And speaking of these reactionary elements, I know this is a question that is difficult to answer because I don't think there's polling done for these types of people. But specifically, obviously, the strategy of the U.S. Military apparatus in Venezuela, as you properly explained, is to change the government to something that they deem more suitable for their own interest. And in order to do so, just like they've done time and time again, both in Central and South America and all over the world, they need a very sizable, not too big, but still sizable reactionary element in the country of, let's call them what they are, quite literal traitors that are willing to betray the ideals of their nation, their state, their class, in order to enrich themselves in this or that form, or gain some political or even sometimes violent power. And in Venezuela in particular, is there a relatively sizable reactionary element that can be utilized, except obviously the Nobel Peace Prize winner, as we all know? Or has that been adequately cracked down on and limited by the government in attempts to pretty much, limit just how much American intervention can spread in the country?
There is still some inside, but not as much. So a lot of it a lot of these people have just left because, again, they've tried so many coup attempts. They all failed. There's been so much violence by these far-right extremists against the Venezuelan government, against Chavistas. I mean, as an example, I highly recommend people should go and watch this, after listening to this episode, go watch the brilliant documentary done by Abby Martin and Mike Preisner on their channel, The Empire Files. And they showed some of the violence in the 2017 coup attempts. They're really brave. They went to the guarimbas and filmed these fascists in Venezuela. And they showed some of the tactics they were using. Like, for instance, one thing that I will never forget is they would light people on fire, and they would especially target Afro-Venezuelans, black Venezuelans. In Spanish, they say Afro-Venezolano, Afrodescendiente, like people of African descent. And because they assumed that basically all black Venezuelans are Chavistas. Because of racism in Venezuela, there are white Venezuelans, Leopoldo Lopez, who is he's related to these Norwegian immigrants, like a Thor Halvorsen, very obviously a Latino name, Thor Halvorsen, who is a Venezuelan oligarch, who's the cousin of Leopoldo Lopez, one of the main far-right oligarchs now living in exile in Spain. Well, who was the leader of many coup attempts in Venezuela. So the elite of Venezuela have historically, like in many Latin American countries, have been white as me, and they are of European descent. But Venezuela also has a pretty sizable black population, and many of them are, because of discrimination, they are relatively poor and working class, and they're mostly Chavistas. So during the coup attempts, these fascists would just kill random black Venezuelans, and there are videos you can find of them lighting black Venezuelans on fire and laughing on video. It's crazy. It's just fascist violence. And another thing that just always has stuck with me is they would also do this thing that a lot of the Chavistas, because they're poor and working class, and this gets to your question, Nick, like in Venezuela, it's poor and working class Venezuelans who overwhelm, like, I'm not saying every working class Venezuelan, but the majority of support from the revolution comes from poor and working class people. And of course, rich people are against the revolution for the most part. There are a few noble exceptions, class traders, but they're almost all against the revolution. And they're now mostly living in exile, self-imposed exile in most cases. Leopoldo Lopez claims he's in exile, but he carried out many coup attempts. So, I mean, whatever. And then there is like a middle class, which I'll talk about in a second. But I always remember that, so a lot of the working class Chavistas cannot afford cars, so they have motorcycles. And what the fascists would do during the coup attempt is there were a few cases where they would put a wire across the road where they made the barricade, the guarimba, and they literally beheaded some people because the Chavistas, they were fighting with the fascists to try to remove the barricades, to open up the road so they can have a functioning society. So they knew that some of the Chavistas would ride in their motorcycle and try to attack them to remove the barricade. So they put up these wires that were really hard to see, and some people were killed. They were beheaded. It's just insane fascist violence that was happening. And this stuff, actually, the media reporting on this at the time, I remember, was so bad. It was so biased. But if you go back in my tweets from like 2014 and 2017, you can find actually... They even admitted in some mainstream outlets, like the Washington Post, I remember, had a reporter who admitted that they were using some of these tactics, like lighting people on fire and bombing government buildings. At one point in 2017, during the coup attempt, there was this fascist, far-right extremist, insane guy who was famous for being like a blue-eyed Venezuelan, obviously, of indigenous descent. This far-right, this fascist guy, he hijacked a helicopter. I don't know how he got the helicopter, but he hijacked a helicopter, and then he went to the city hall and he threw grenades and tried to blow up City Hall, and then later he was killed, and he was turned into like this great martyr. I mean, like, the levels of violence we're talking about were so extreme in Venezuela, and this stuff has just all been memory hold. Anyway, to get back to this point, though, about the class dynamics. So the thing about Venezuela is that Venezuela, compared to other countries in Latin America, every country in Latin America has like a petty bourgeois, like a total elite, like the comprador elites, who are always a small percentage of the population, usually of European descent, or in the case of Peru, they're all also Japanese descent, like the Fujimori family. But I mean, they're not people of indigenous descent. And they're a small elite who have governed most of these countries for a long time. In Bolivia, it's a country of majority indigenous descent, but many of the elites are white. It's a true story in many of these countries. In Venezuela, that elite was actually a bit bigger because of oil. Usually it's like we're talking about a few families in places like Bolivia or Colombia or Guatemala or Honduras. In the case of Venezuela, there still are these very powerful families who the leaders of the right-wing opposition are from these families. But you also had a bigger kind of elite population because of the trickle down from the oil money. Now, that money did not go to the vast majority of the population, but there was like this kind of petty bourgeoisie that survived on serving the super elites, because Venezuela had so much oil that these families, I'm not joking here, that previously during the last coup attempt in Venezuela, the fake Juan Guaido ambassador to the UK was a wealthy Venezuelan she's actually British Venezuelan. She has a British passport. She used to be Mick Jagger's girlfriend, and very wealthy, of European descent, tens or hundreds of millions probably in her family. And she wrote a book back when her book is of course all attacking the Bolivarian Revolution. And she's so oblivious to class politics and so elite that in her book, which is all talking about how evil the Chavistas were and all this, she talked about how when she was a child, she would fly to Miami, Florida to go shopping and then fly back at night. And then she said that she and her family would joke about how poor people in Florida were compared to her family. She was saying that people in the US were poor compared to her family. I mean, the level, like these elites who used to rule Venezuela, it makes you understand why they're so violent, they're so fascist, they're so willing to kill as many people as possible to retake control, because they used to be some of the richest people in the world. And they lost all of that when Chavez nationalized the oil and kicked out the US oil corporations and took power away from the elites. And Maria Corina Machado is related to these families, as a cousin. They're all intermarried. They're all these elites. It's very incestuous. And she has made it very clear. She said openly, Maria Corina Machado is the so-called Nobel Peace Prize winner. Like with Henry Kissinger and Obama and the
great
CIA.
company. What great bedfellows.
Yeah, I mean, it's nonsense. So she admitted in an interview in English, by the way, you don't even have to speak Spanish, in an English interview with Donald Trump Jr. on Rumble, she admitted that when she wants to be put in power, the plan is she would probably be vice president, because she never was a presidential candidate. So they couldn't, I don't think they'll succeed in overthrowing Maduro, but if they did, they would put this puppet Edmundo Gonzalez as the president, because they claim that supposedly he won the election based on groups that the US government funded, claiming that supposedly Maduro stole the election, and Edmundo Gonzalez was the candidate. So they would put him in as the puppet. I mean, this guy is he's like Joe Biden. He's not there. I mean, he's completely senile, not to be ageist, but I mean, this guy is like fossil. He would be the fake president. Behind him as VP would be Maria Corina Machado. She would be the real power behind the throne, like Dick Cheney, R.I.P., rest in piss.
Sorry.
So Maria Corina Machado admitted she would, if the U.S. succeeds in overthrowing Maduro, she will be the de facto, the real power behind the throne, running the de facto leader of Venezuela. She admitted in this interview with Donald Trump Jr. that she wants to privatize not only the oil, but also the natural gas and the gold and the other natural resources in Venezuela. She wants to privatize all state-owned enterprises and institutions. And she said that she welcomes in U.S. corporations to invest. And she openly said, you will make a lot of money. She said that to Donald Trump Jr.'s friends. So that's the plan.
In a public fucking conversation. It was so surreal when I saw it. It's
what I don't understand is like this should just be like you print this out like a picture of her from the interview. You write the quotation text and you just write this and then just plaster it all over the entirety of Venezuela. And then this is just, it should be like, you know, before the news starts, whoever's the current like, you know, puppet in running for the Americans, you just have like a short 1-minute clip of all the traitorous shit that they say.
Yeah.
Just to undo all the.
They do that in Venezuela, which is why, by the way, Maria Corina Machado is very unpopular. So this gets back to your question, Hugo. You asked about the situation in Venezuela. Most of the elites that have like a lot of money have left. They're in Florida, they're in Madrid, you know, but there still are, I would say, like, I'll be honest, like the kind of middle class in Venezuela, it does not support the government. It's the working class and poor people. And many of them are willing to fight, and they're the majority of the population. But a lot of the middle class, these are people who like had jobs that many of them were like, they were making dollars. And this is like a problem that exists in many global South countries. I'm sure, Hakeem, you know about this in West Asia, or even it kind of even exists, you know, in like the periphery of Europe, right? Where you have these people who have like internet jobs, and they often get paid in foreign currency, like dollars or euro, and they make so much money compared to the local population that even though they're not like the super elite, they're like this separate strata of society. Yeah. And all those people in Venezuela who get paid in dollars, they all hate the government. But a lot of them have, if they had enough money to leave, they left. But even the people who don't have enough money to leave, like those people, but they're not the ones who are going to fight. But the point is that every time Maria Corina Machado, she's like I've personally seen her with my eyes. Like I wanted to interview her. I tried to. And like, because I was in Venezuela reporting on this. And I remember in 2019 during the coup attempt, I actually went to a right-wing rally that was held in Chacao, which is a very wealthy part of Caracas. Technically, it's independent, but like an autonomous part, because the rich people there didn't want to be part of Caracas, so they got their autonomy. But anyway, they're living their little bubble, like Miami, a little bubble of Miami located in Venezuela. So I went to one of their right-wing rallies. There were not that many people there, a few hundred, and compared to the many thousands who show up to Chavista rallies. And Maria Corina Machado was there. I saw her, and I was like, can I interview you? And she said, I'm not doing interviews right now. And she was surrounded by all these people taking selfies with her and all of this. So, I mean, this idea that like now there is an arrest warrant out for her because she's obviously she's been involved in so many coup attempts. But she used to just like walk around and have rallies, mostly in like the very wealthy elite part of Caracas, to the east, like the east center part of it. And then they would hold these rallies. And as recently as like 2 years ago, they would have still have some before the last election that she claimed that was supposedly fraud based on, you know, Elon Musk gave her, she admitted this in an interview, Elon Musk gave her all of these Starlink satellites to post all this bogus claims online that supposedly there was fraud. Well, she used to hold rallies, and like you can see videos online. There were like 200 people who would show up to these rallies. Yeah. So obviously, like they don't have the actual numbers they need to overthrow the government, which is why they're hoping the U.S. will do it for them.
Yeah. I was gonna say you mentioned two interesting things. This is maybe some of our more Western audience might not know regarding life in the imperial periphery, but when we mention people getting paid in dollars, it makes like there's some, or the vast majority, I believe, of the imperial periphery where there are these, you know, professional managerial quote unquote internet jobs, like Ben said, where they get paid in dollars. This creates this pay differential between regular people in these countries and these people who are paid by foreign companies, usually American or other Western European companies. And it causes them to live ridiculous lives. And as a result, of course, this forms their class position and subsequently their political opinions. When I was in med school, there was a lady from Ukraine. And if you don't know, the vast majority of Ukrainians, even before all this, the war and stuff was happening, are very poor. They're essentially, they're barely living, right? The quality of infrastructure in Ukraine is very poor. The quality of healthcare and education, everything is gone down so incredibly significantly. It is arguably, after Moldova, the worst off country following the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union. But her dad worked for Cisco, which is the American telecommunications company, I believe. They create internet and fiber networks and telephone stuff, as far as I know. And he was
Yeah.
paid like a regular American salary for a an upper middle management guy, which is probably like somewhere between 60 to 100K USD per year. But in Ukraine, that puts you like right underneath the layer of oligarchic, like the people who bought up state enterprises worth many billions of dollars for like a couple 100,000 or a few million, right? It makes you ridiculously wealthy in there. And the political opinions that lady had, of course, force-fed to her by her parents, like everything from her view of the Soviet Union to what the Ukraine should be, and so on and so forth. Completely opposite to what regular Ukrainians thought at the time, even to this day. But when you go into the third world, this goes into overdrive because in Ukraine, for example, there is some semblance, at least before the current stuff going on, there's some semblance of, for example, worker protection, some semblance of it, and not much. But if you go to, for example, Guatemala, where you have, a driver and servants and a cook and many cleaners and a nanny for your children, if they upset you or whatever, you can beat them, you could even kill them, and really nothing will happen to you. It's a few, like an uncomfortable discussion at the police station, and a few, what's it called, under the table, not parcels, with envelopes passed as bribes, and then afterwards the problem disappears. Like these people, when you mention they fly back and forth from Miami to back to Venezuela to do some shopping, it's very difficult because like the United States, you don't see people this wealthy. You see people well off, but you don't see oligarchic levels of wealth in
Oligarchic
society,
levels of
like in
power. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
in
of
society,
what
they're
it
usually
buys
so,
them locally. Yeah.
Yeah, there's in their gated communities. You never see them. You never see that, right? But in third world countries, quote unquote third world countries, you see a little more. It is very interesting.
It's so funny that, like, for example, middle class Venezuelans, they can no longer make their dollar cash working for Western companies. That they're blaming this on the Venezuelan government. Who the fuck is sanctioning you? Who is not allowing you to work for a Western company? The fucking Americans. You dumb fucking cretin. Maybe you should be against the fucking sanctions and the empire that is imposing them on you. It is so surreal to look at a relatively principled governance method that then causes empire to whip the living shit out of you, and for you to say, the guy getting whipped, which is actually me, we're the bad guy. We should follow every single instruction that they give us, because we always come back to class, because I don't see the national project, I don't see the class project, I don't see anti-imperialism.
I want to go fly to Miami.
I want money back, I want that good old paycheck, and so on and so on. Exactly. It makes you borderline ideologically a traitor to your people, even low-key your species. But that's a conversation we've all had plenty of times. Let's just spread
one
it
quick
out.
Note on this.
Yep, please.
One quick note. What Hakeem said, it's so true in Latin America. It's true in all parts of the global South and the periphery. And what's sad, really, is you think about it, it shows the power of unequal exchange and the power of imperialism, is that the U.S. empire can pay off so many people so cheaply from their perspective. I mean, obviously, the U.S. prints the global reserve currency, so there's no limit to what they can do. But I mean, like, from the perspective of the U.S. empire, like, for instance, when you look at the amount of money distributed through USAID and the NED and these CIA cutouts, a lot of people in the U.S., they hear that and they're like, well, that's that a few $1 million doesn't sound like a lot of money. But when you're in Latin America, when you're in West Asia,
so far.
and when you look at the exchange rate, like someone who's getting paid like $1,000 a month, that immediately puts them like in the top 5% richest part of these populations. So it's just like, we're talking about countries where with their exchange rate, people in Latin America are often making like $200 to $400 a month. So if you're getting paid like $1,000 a month, I mean, even though you're obviously not the bourgeoisie, like this completely, it completely polarizes societies politically in a way that makes it very difficult to have a unified class project, because the US and the EU is also very guilty of this. Because, if you're getting paid in euro, it's the same thing. If you're getting paid, €1,000 a month. That's a lot of money. Working for some NGO talking about human rights or some nonsense while you're trying to destabilize the government. Like it creates this kind of this. I don't even know what you would call the class. Like it's not really comprador because like they're not the bourgeoisie.
The
They don't
cuck
actually own
class.
capital. Yeah, but it's just like, and it's a way of it. And what happens is like if you're a well-educated person, everyone strives to get one of those jobs. So instead of like helping to develop your country, you end up just being a subcontractor for imperialism.
Yep.
And
That's
there's
the
so
term.
much brain drain. Like if there's already brain drain for people who leave the country and work in the global north, but then the people who stay, they're like the subcontractors. And instead of like these are the people who should be doctors and scientists and engineers, and they should be developing their country. Instead, they work for some stupid NGO.
Marketing for an NGO or something. My favorite part about the NGO business is in the offices of, I don't remember what it was, but it was one of these like, Center for Democratic Studies, bullshit, something like this, in Caracas. And they had an official office that closed down, I think, like 22 hours after Trump decided to cut down USA. And at the same time, the Miami Herald came out and was like, we are losing 92% of our funding. We will not survive. Please give us money so we can keep talking shit about Cuba. Like it's
one quick note on this as well. I know I keep saying one quick note, but this
No,
is important.
you're
beautiful.
fine. You're
Please
fine.
Trump, he's so full. I mean, just completely. I can cuss, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
What
So
the
full of
fuck?
shit.
Yes. Yeah.
Obviously,
so
so
cute.
full of shit. And Marco Rubio, like this whole like populist bullshit, completely fake.
Of course.
But one of the things that they were actually pretty successful at is convincing people they shut down the NED and USAID. Completely false. A lot of people, even well-intentioned people, believe that. Not true. What they did is they merged it into the State Department, and the NED, they merged USAID into the State Department. But the money still is there. And now Marco Rubio, also known as Narco Rubio, because speaking of being linked to drugs, look into this. The Florida media reported that Marco Rubio lived with his brother-in-law for a long time when his brother-in-law was trafficking millions of dollars of cocaine. They lived in the same house. Marco Rubio obviously knew about that. And then after his brother-in-law got out of jail, after he was imprisoned for trafficking millions of dollars of cocaine, Marco Rubio used his position to pull strings in the Florida government to get a real estate license for his convicted felon brother-in-law. So anyway, that's why he's known as Narco Rubio. But getting back to Rubio, Marco Rubio, this insane neoconservative coup plotter who spent his entire life trying to overthrow the Cuban government and the Venezuelan and the Nicaraguan government, he is now overseeing USAID money, and he's overseeing NED. The NED still is operating, and the NED published a press release on their website acknowledging that the State Department, under Marco Rubio's leadership, unfroze the money for the NED after all of this Doge nonsense with, Elon Musk, after all of the so-called fake right-wing populists. They claim that they were fighting the deep state. Meanwhile, the deep state continues to operate, and Marco Rubio is overseeing this money, and the NED admitted in their press release that where is that money going? They said it's going to supporting pro-democracy groups in Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, Russia, and China. Those are the countries they named.
They redirected it and removed any of the money that went to, I don't know, solving this or that plague in this or that corner of the world to make sure that 100% of it goes to big gun in a small man's hands.
Instead of 90.
Yeah, exactly. True. Before we move on to talking about more, let's say, more shining red parts of the world. That was some sort of allusion to the East. I don't fucking know what I did there. I apologize to the audience. We talked specifically about Venezuela. You also talked about a lot of other places in Central and South America to contextualize it, both historically and from the imperial context and the class context and so on. I just wanna.
I'm getting such a good going through and going over these topics, I should be in a shower listening to this.
Oh God!
I might need to
God.
strip for you, Ben.
HR, please take this man out of the
Well,
room.
for all we know, you already are naked. I mean,
Yeah,
Exactly
this
right.
is what I always. Yeah.
It's okay. The cam will come on once the recording turns off, so I have plausible deniability.
When you start,
much like USA. No, go on. Sorry.
when you hear shit getting hitting the table while talking to Hakeem, you never know if it's the microphone or something else. But yes, I want to finish up because we were talking about the historical context and to an extent what is currently happening. And now to finish it off, I'm going to say it for the 700th time. All of these developments are probably not going unnoticed by the rest of South and Central America. If you had to play a somewhat anti-intellectual game of us versus them, what countries of that region would you paint as neutral, American puppets, and anti-American? Just so the audience that's not from that part of the world can kind of, I don't know, create a baseline image of the scale of both what Venezuela's facing and what the entire region is facing when it comes to the never-ending onslaught of America basically saying, no, you're not real countries, you're just our small colonies.
Yeah, very interesting question. I will add just a little note. I'm not in any way like policing your language or anything, because a lot of people don't know this. I think you'd be curious to know. So in Latin America, when people say America, they're referring to all of the Americas from the northern tip, Canada, down to Argentina. So they wouldn't call themselves anti-American because, in fact, many of them have this idea of what's known as the Patria Grande, which means the great fatherland or great motherland, which means the unifying Latin America. And there are some great parties, including there's a left-wing party in Argentina, which is called La Patria Grande, and their symbol is the map from Mexico down to Argentina. And fortunately, they leave out the U.S. and Canada, as they should. So anyway, so in terms of anti-U.S. Governments and anti-imperialist governments, because I will be clear, I semi-jokingly say I'm a former American. I'm also a naturalized dual citizen of Nicaragua. When I'm not in China, I live in Nicaragua, and I don't live in the U.S. and haven't for several years. And I kind of semi-jokingly say I'm a former American, but I still do have a U.S. passport, and I've been involved with the Latin American left for a long time, and I've never people. There's just so many stereotypes and so much nonsense. It's just racism, claiming that you have to be careful. If you're from the U.S., if you're a white American, if you go to like Venezuela or Cuba, they're gonna spit on you and attack you. People have only ever been super friendly because they know that I support their revolutionary struggle, and that they know that there are people in the U.S. who are anti-imperialist. And in fact, in the case of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which are the three countries with revolutionary socialist governments, they have always gone out of their way to express solidarity with the people of the U.S. in popular struggles, especially Black Americans, women, Indigenous Americans, Muslims. They've always have shown so much solidarity. For instance, Comandante Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua, he, for his entire political career, has always talked about revolutionary struggles in the U.S. He's always honored people from the U.S. Famously, Brian Wilson, which is also the name of in this case, a truly honorable R.I.P. to the guy from the Beach Boys, who's a genius. But there's another Brian Wilson who was even cooler, who was Brian Wilson, a U.S. citizen who was an anti-imperialist, a socialist, and an anti-war activist, a friend of mine. He had fought in the Vietnam War and was radicalized and became a socialist and anti-imperialist. And then in the 1980s, he was an activist with solidarity with Nicaragua and Central America. And when the Reagan administration was sending weapons to the Contra death squads in Nicaragua, activists, they tried to stop the weapons from going by putting their bodies on the railroads. And he and many other activists, they went and they put their bodies on the railroads to try to stop the train. And the Reagan administration, Reagan himself reportedly said to not stop the train. And his other friends, his other comrades, they got off the tracks, and he didn't get off of the tracks in time. and he lost both of his legs. The Reagan administration intentionally tried to kill a U.S. citizen who was protesting against the weapons being sent to the Contra des Squads in Nicaragua. He lost both of his legs. Still today, he has prosthetic legs, and he's a national hero. He's literally is a national hero, honored by a law in Nicaragua as a national hero. He's a U.S. citizen who now lives in Nicaragua, and every year on the anniversary of the revolution, of the Sandinista revolution, he is on stage with the leaders of the revolution, with the ambassadors of China and Venezuela and Russia and Cuba and Iran. He's on stage with them as this honorary example of a U.S. citizen, an American a North American, as they say, Norteamericano, who expressed solidarity. So like the Latin American left has always, like they always say, I've heard this so many times, they always say, we're against the U.S. government, not the people of the U.S. And they always make it clear that the U.S. oligarchy, the capitalist class, is also the enemy of the U.S. people, not only the enemy of the people of Latin America. Anyway, so getting back to your question, with all of that said, so I mentioned that the three, the powerful revolutionary countries that John Bolton, the war criminal, famously referred to as the troika of tyranny. I would call them the troika of resistance. Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. These are the countries with explicitly anti-imperialist socialist governments. Bolivia used to be in that camp, but unfortunately, which I don't have time to get into, because of infighting in the Bolivian left, which is very tragic, the left tore itself apart, and they were divided. They divided the vote three ways in the last election. If they had combined, they would have won the election, but they divided. So the right wing won the Bolivian election. They have a new U.S. puppet leader who's coming into power, and Bolivia is going to be leaving this alliance. But they were the revolutionary socialist governments. And then you have left-wing governments that are pretty good, actually. Mexico's government has been very impressive, very principled. And actually, Mexico has a revolutionary history that they're bringing back. And Mexico had a glorious revolution starting in 1910 until 1920 with, famous leaders like people know about Zapata.
Of course.
But also later, a bit after, and then you have Pancho Villa and others, but then a bit after, you also, it's very funny, but there was a revolutionary party that was called the PRI, which was called the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And the idea of this party was to institutionalize the gains of the revolution, which was founded by an anti-imperialist and a socialist named Lázaro Cárdenas, who nationalized the oil of Mexico. He nationalized the railroads of Mexico and the energy grid. He was a very radical leader, left-wing leader. And now Mexico has had two leaders now who have been very progressive, very left-wing, and they're bringing back that legacy of what are known as the Cardenistas. And that was previously Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, the previous president, and the current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, who have both been very impressive. They have been among the most popular leaders on earth, with approval ratings of around 80%. The minimum wage in Mexico has risen many times. The standard of living for average people has risen many times. It's very good. And also, they're bringing back Mexico's old school style of foreign policy, which is called the Estrada Doctrine, which was the previous doctrine before the neoliberal turn in Mexican politics in the 1970s. Before that, Mexico actually had always maintained a policy of neutrality and non-alignment. And in fact, even during the first Cold War, Mexico's relations with the Soviet Union were actually not that bad. And famously, according to the CIA, of course, we have to take everything the CIA says with a grain of salt, but the CIA claimed that outside of Eurasia, the largest number of Soviet spies were in Mexico City, allegedly, according to the CIA. And I actually think it could be true, because Mexico was trying to play this kind of non-aligned position. And let's not forget that when Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara, when they were preparing to launch the Cuban Revolution, they were planning it in Mexico. And a lot of revolutionaries from not only Latin America, but even from Spain, after the Spanish Civil War, when the fascists won, they went to Mexico. Mexico became like the center of left-wing exiles from across the Spanish-speaking world. And this was true, for instance, in Chile. I'm friends with Pablo Sepúlveda Allende, who is the grandson of Salvador Allende, who is the revolutionary democratically elected socialist of Chile, the first ever democratically elected Marxist leader. And of course, the U.S. made sure he died in a CIA coup to make sure that no other Marxist would ever be allowed to be voted in an election in history, to make sure that that you can never that the bourgeoisie would never allow that to happen. So anyway, after Allende was killed in the CIA coup on the 11th of September of 1973, the first 9/11, if you will, what happened to the Allende family? They went to Mexico, and his grandson was born in Mexico. So, I mean, what's happening in some countries in Latin America is they're bringing back this kind of legacy of at least non-alignment, if not outright anti-imperialism. I would not call the Mexican government ideologically anti-imperialist, but I would say their foreign policy has been very principled and has been in support of the global South. Colombia, I never thought I would say this. Colombia, for the first time in modern history, has a left-wing government that actually does have a pretty anti-imperialist foreign policy. And it's not as principled as like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, but it's up there. And this is why, of course, the U.S. is sanctioning Colombia and trying to meddle in Colombia's election, which is coming up next year. And what's very interesting about this is it's symbolic because Hugo Chavez, the founder of the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela, he famously referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America, pointing out that, Israel is an unsinkable U.S. aircraft carrier for the U.S. empire in West Asia, one of the most geostrategic regions of the world, connecting, West Asia into the Mediterranean. And similarly, Colombia, right in the northern tip of South America, with access to both the Pacific and the Caribbean, it plays a key geopolitical role, also linking to Panama. And of course, the world's leading producer of cocaine, and the CIA has historically used the cocaine trade to fund its operations in Latin America, like the Contras in Nicaragua and other operations. So this is why Chavez famously said that Colombia played the same role historically in Latin America that Israel plays in West Asia. So having the loss of Colombia is a big loss to the U.S., which is why they're really meddling to try to bring back a right-wing regime next year in Colombia, which unfortunately is a very real possibility. And then very briefly, I'll go through the rest. Argentina has one of the worst leaders on earth, this U.S. puppet and anarcho-capitalist Javier Milei, a psycho who claims that he talks to his dead dogs through...
Probably fucks his sister. Let's be fucking honest here. I don't know. I mean, yeah.
So, I mean, in all seriousness,
fucks his people and his sister. A true leader of our times. Yeah.
His people a little bit harder, but so in all seriousness,
that's so sad.
Well, yeah. Let's not forget he rug pulled his own people, his own supporters, supporting like this meme coin scam. But anyway, his sister Karina. So in Argentina, like in most countries, when you have an inauguration, the president, who is, usually a man because of historical, sexism, or a woman too, usually when they have the inauguration, they're with their partner, right? So usually the president is with his wife. Well, Milei also does not have a partner. So who was his partner at his inauguration was his sister. Okay. So yeah, complete puppet. And then in neighboring Chile, it's interesting. It's honestly the worst of the left-wing governments in Latin America. It's so bad. The southern cone of Latin America has the worst politics because you have Argentina, which has these insane right-wingers, and ANCAPs who think that, an ANCAP who wants to take state power, crazy. And then next to them, in Chile, they have a bunch of fascists and descendants of Nazis who were in the Pinochet regime. Literally, Jose Antonio Cast, who was the last right-wing presidential candidate and probably will be the next right-wing presidential candidate. He's literally the grandson of a Nazi who fled to Chile, and he himself was a strong supporter. His dad was in the Pinochet regime, and he was a youth member of the Pinochet youth. He strongly supported Pinochet, and still today, he publicly supports Pinochet. I mean, these guys are fascists. So, and on the other side, so you either have grandchildren of Nazis on one side, or you have stupid NGO ultra-left anarchists is the left-wing option in Chile. So in Argentina, you have the only the only ANCAP who's a president of a country. And then in Chile, you have the only self-declared libertarian socialist who's the leader of a country. And both have complete shit politics. And Chile has often allied with the right wing in Latin America against the left because the president, Gabriel Boric, claims that he's so concerned about human rights and democracy, but he also says he's a libertarian socialist, but he says he hates tankies. He uses the term tank. Literally, an internet anarchist is the leader. So you have ANCAPs in charge of Argentina and stupid anarcho-libs in charge of Chile. I mean, Latin America is everything.
Yeah, and then, incredible. It's all computer.
Then finally, I could go on and on. I'll mention 2 other countries briefly. I could go on and on, but I mentioned Honduras has a good left-wing government. Ecuador has a crazy right-wing government led by a literal U.S. citizen. It's crazy they allow this. But, like we talked about in Moldova, like in Moldova, most of the people who govern the country are Romanians. Well, in Ecuador, the president of the country is a U.S. citizen who was born in Miami, Florida, named Daniel Noboa. He's also the son of the richest oligarch in the country, the multimillionaire Alvaro Noboa. And his dad, everyone knows, his dad has private ports because they privatize ports, the right-wing governments. And in his ports, everyone knows he traffics cocaine in banana crates. I mean, it's crazy. Like, you can't make this stuff up. He's one of the closest U.S. allies in Latin America. And by the way, right after he was inaugurated as president, Daniel Noboa and his wife, they flew to Miami, Florida. His wife is an Instagram model, of course. They flew to Miami, Florida, so she could give birth to their kid to make sure their kid is a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
And then they flew back to Ecuador, where he signed a law allowing the U.S. military to enter Ecuador at any time for any reason without any oversight. And he's now trying to reopen military bases in Ecuador, which the Constitution is against because they had a left-wing leader, Rafael Correa, who rewrote the Constitution in a referendum to make sure that there could be no foreign military bases. Well, now he's trying to rewrite the Constitution to allow the U.S. military to reopen bases. So he's the oligarch U.S. citizen fail son in charge of Ecuador. And then finally, there's Brazil. And Brazil's complicated. Brazil is the biggest country in Latin America in terms of population with the biggest economy. And it has a lot of potential. And the Workers' Party's kind of in charge, at least Lula is president. And, we all know Lula. It's a long story, but he's mostly good, mostly an ally of the Latin American left and founder of BRICS. And, I'm not totally an uncritical supporter, but he's mostly good. And, of course, the other option in Brazil are the fascist Bolsonaristas. But the problem in Brazil is that the Workers' Party only has a small minority of control in Congress, and there's not a lot they can accomplish. And the Bolsonaristas, the far-right, fascist U.S.-backed opposition, are still, there's a chance they could potentially come to power. So in the situation in Latin America is really a mixed bag. And we're in a moment, it goes back and forth, ebbs and flows. Like, there are some moments where the left is really strong. And I think we're in a moment now where the left is weakening a bit. And that's, of course, very concerning with all of these U.S. attacks. But it always goes back and forth. I mean, the left will never go away because this is one of the regions of the world where the left is still very, very strong.
Thank you for that incredible overview. So I give the floor to Hakeem to take us a little bit further east.
Yes, absolutely. And that is towards something that you covered very beautifully in a series of 2 or 3 videos now. But I want to just hear kind of a little bit of an overview of it. And that is the failed trade war that the Americans started, or Trump started. In your wording, you made a distinction that it wasn't the war that has lost, but the Americans lost a very important battle in it, and that being the, I guess, not normalization, but the 1-year pause of relations between the U.S. and China regarding the back and forth tariffs and other silliness that has been going on recently. And the most important part of it is that China has emerged as a clear peer nation economically and so on and so forth. And this is a significant shifting of tides. A lot of people seem to think that at the time the Soviet Union was a peer nation to the US, which it wasn't. The Soviet Union, despite its tremendous, incredible achievements, was at best, at its largest, like almost half the size of the American economy, and far more limited otherwise, despite their significant, genuinely like incredible developments. Politically, economically, technologically, and whatnot. The Chinese are entirely different league of their own. Around if not already, but for sure over the next 5 years, China and the Chinese economy and Chinese government will be the most advanced society that humanity has ever created. And that's not hyperbole. That is just by standard metrics of innovation and technological development. That has never happened in the world, that the United States would be shifted out of happened. I mean, in the history of the United States since its ascendance. My question really leads into what happened here. When you look at China in like 2012, you didn't hear things like this, and now all of a sudden, it is the sole contender and surpasser of the United States in a far more progressive and pleasant ways. Tell us a little bit what's going on with the economic development there and the trade war that has shifted to the favor of the Chinese.
Excellent. Well, I'm sure we have another hour and a half to talk about this topic, right?
Absolutely, yes.
I'll try
Go
to
right
keep it
ahead.
brief. I know I have a tendency to bloviate. It's always a problem I have. But this is a huge topic. This answer is not giving enough justice to it, but I'll keep it in a nutshell. Okay, so China very strategically, when it decided to normalize relations with the U.S. and the broader West, starting in 1971, 1972, it never abandoned, of course, the socialist path. And I even actually, obviously I'm very pro-China, but I do have even some criticisms of I think the Sino-Soviet split was a tragedy for everyone, obviously, but it's not entirely wrong to say that China kind of formed a de facto unspoken alliance with the U.S. against the Soviet Union, which is very sad for world socialism. That is basically true. But with that said, it's not accurate to say that China just completely allied with the U.S. and did whatever the U.S. wanted. Instead, it was kind of an opportunist alliance of convenience where China, its focus was developing as much as possible. And if the Soviet Union fell, well, they thought they maybe thought that would be a good thing. But their main goal was to have technology transfer and foreign investment to reduce poverty, to develop, and they did it. But they never abandoned the socialist path, of course. And even when Mao died, and by the way, a lot of people like ultra-leftists love to pit everything on Deng Xiaoping and say that he was the one who betrayed the revolution and restored capitalism and all this nonsense. In fact, many of the things that Deng did, starting in 1978, Mao actually was already doing in the 70s. There was a famous agreement called the 4-3 Agreement in the 1970s, where Mao took on a bunch of loans to get a lot of technology transfer from the US, from France, from West Germany, from Japan, all the imperialist powers, because he was like, we need technology. We are very underdeveloped, and we need to catch up technologically. So Deng continued that process with partial privatization. There was also some privatizations. A lot of the privatizations actually they were not that big under Deng Xiaoping, and then they were more under Jiang Zemin, and then they were paused after that. Although when Jiang Zemin did the privatizations, the slogan was not privatize everything. The slogan was grasp the big, let go of the small. So basically almost everything in the Chinese economy was state-owned, including all of the hotels and the restaurants and the grocery stores and all of that. Basically, the government decided, and a lot of those businesses were losing money. So basically, the government decided they were going to privatize the non-strategic parts of the economy, the non-commanding heights, and allow private TV factories and hotels and restaurants and all this stuff. And also, it was a way of helping to repair the government balance sheet because they were losing money in some of this stuff. So, but like I said, 55% still today of all of the assets of all of the companies in China are from state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises. So the majority of the economy, it's about 1/3 of GDP, but that kind of underestimates because a lot of GDP is not as, you look at GDP, it's an aggregate. Some parts of GDP are not as important as other parts. Like the commanding heights are in public ownership. Okay, so I've established all of that about how the socialist system in China works. Now, another key part of this was a strong emphasis on technological development. Of course, the Soviet Union also had this, right? The Soviet Union was a technological powerhouse. And let's not forget, the Soviets were the first country to send people into space, and they sent the first satellite, Sputnik. I mean, they made huge progress in all of this. But for a variety of geopolitical reasons and internal reasons and oil reasons in the 70s and 80s, they began to stagnate. So China has always been afraid of repeating that stagnation. So one of the things that they've heavily emphasized is they need to pour resources as much as possible into innovation. That is number one goal. Literally in the new 5-year plan, the number one goal is technological upgrading. And China, yes, still has 5-year plans. This is the latest from 2026 to 2030. And the first two goals are moving up the value chain advancing technologically in artificial intelligence and semiconductors and green energy and nuclear energy and all this. So this is a huge, huge priority for China. And one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that when Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up in 78, the slogan was not just like, let private capital in and do whatever it wants. No. The famous slogan in China, in Chinese, was technology transfer for market access. And this is what happened, which is 市场换技术, market for technology. So what they did is they said, okay, we will allow foreign investment in certain industries under the two conditions. One, you have to form a joint venture with a Chinese company so they can develop up their own local manufacturing and not just provide cheap labor for foreign capital. And two, you have to share your technology with us. Now, the US companies voluntarily agreed to this. It was a condition for investing in China, but they wanted to invest in China. They wanted to exploit low-paid Chinese workers. At that time, wages are way higher now, higher than in most of the global south. And they wanted to get access to the enormous China market, which now has 1.4 billion people. These companies voluntarily agreed to do that. Later, the narrative became that it was so-called forced technology transfer. It was not forced. Even mainstream bourgeois legal scholars in the US have admitted that it was not forced. It was part of the condition of access. So because what happens is, if you listen to a lot of neoliberal economists, they say, bring in foreign investment, but foreign investment is not necessarily bad, but it is bad when you're not actually developing your own productive forces. If you're just having foreign investment to exploit local labor, but you don't have any technology transfer, you don't develop your own technological capacity, you don't develop your own local companies, all you're doing is providing cheap labor, and you never move up the global value chain. This is what many global south countries have been stuck in, where they just provide the cheap labor and they never actually add the value to the production process, which is where uneven development comes from, right? So China always made it clear that its goal with the investment was to move up the value chain and technologically advance. This has been one of the key priorities, and now it is literally the number one priority. The problem in the US, one of the many problems, but in terms of the trade war, is a lot of people drank their own Kool-Aid. They still believe that the Chinese economy is all a Potemkin village. It's all fake. That Chinese workers are all slaves. And I mean, you've seen, Nick, like this is a very well-developed modern society.
Absurdly.
Yeah, with some of the best infrastructure in the world, at least in the top cities. And they're working on reducing the inequality between the rural areas and the cities. There's still issues. But the point is that like a lot of people who never been to China, who drank that Kool-Aid, they truly believed that China's economy is a basket case. They would impose tariffs on China and it would collapse. I mean, this is the danger of believing your own propaganda, drinking your own Kool-Aid. And this is why Scott Bessent said, China, we have all the cards. China's playing with a losing hand. They're so dependent on exporting to us, they're going to collapse. And of course, the exact opposite happened. It's actually the US economy, which is in a much worse situation, which I could talk about if you want. And the US is actually, ironically, more dependent on China because as the US government encouraged this outsourcing by US companies, China recognized that the number one goal is developing the productive economy, manufacturing and technology, and the government maintained control of finance and all of the parasitic sectors of the economy. The US economy did the exact opposite. The US outsourced its manufacturing and the US economy financialized. Everyone became a real estate agent or a crypto bro doing all rug pulls to each other. And then like anyone who gets a PhD in science or math, they all go work at a hedge fund or something. They all become a quant. Like the US economy has been completely hollowed out by the capitalist class. So they actually, ironically, they're more dependent now on this country that is, China kind of in the semi-periphery, that they actually cannot function economically, the US, without China, which is why the US was forced to take this pause on the trade war and try to find a new strategy.
China used the contradiction of capitalists willing to almost exclusively concentrate on short-term benefits against themselves. That's how I like to view it, and maybe potentially simplify to some members of the audience that might need a simplification, which is obviously you're a normal grass toucher, which is absolutely acceptable to an extent. The oldest and low-key cliche quote, the capitalist will eventually sell us the rope we will hang them with, is how I see Chinese economic development of the last 30 years, and it's the contradiction keeps expanding and expanding and expanding in America, in the United States proper, and in the capitalist concentration of wealth to such an extent that it's just making the Chinese bigger and bigger. But they still keep drinking the Kool-Aid and believing that they can toss the PRC around as if it's still, I don't know, 1925. But they are in for a very, very rude awakening. Hakeem, do you have the? Oh, sorry, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick thought. What you said there reminded me of this. Hakeem has a really good video about unequal exchange and uneven development. But for people who don't know about unequal exchange, you can check out Hakeem's video after this. No. But I think when we're talking about imperialism, it's very important to understand that one of the reasons that unequal exchange is possible is because of a very unequal international division of labor. And this is a point that I often emphasize to try to understand imperialism, which is that one of the goals of capitalism is maintaining this uneven development where the periphery, the capital investment and capital formation and also worker development, what they call human capital, is not developed enough to actually challenge the high value added monopoly sectors in the core. So the capitalists in the core can have monopoly super profits because they don't want to compete with anyone else. So this is why one of the goals of imperialism has always been to deindustrialize the periphery. Latin America, throughout the 1980s and 90s, during the neoliberal structural adjustment imposed by the IMF, Latin America was deindustrialized. If you look at South America's manufacturing share of GDP, it actually, in the 60s, in the peak of the kind of Peronist style import substitution industrialization model, South America had the highest percentage of manufacturing in GDP out of the entire global South, higher than many parts of Europe, but certainly higher than Africa and Asia. But what we've seen in both Africa and Asia is manufacturing, not in Asia, because what we've seen in Africa and Latin America since the rise of neoliberalism is manufacturing share of GDP has fallen, and these regions of the world are much more dependent on exporting commodities, raw materials, primary products to the core. And then the U.S., so how does this relate to China? The goal of the U.S. was to, when we look at imperialism and this international division of labor as a kind of hierarchy, the U.S. strategy of the capitalist class was to globalize production and make this global hierarchy of labor. And in the core, on top would be the U.S., slightly below them would be Europe, and then below them would be, semi-periphery countries. And the idea is that very high value added manufacturing and high tech sectors and intellectual property monopolies and software development, all of the stuff with very high margins and finance, that would be concentrated in the US. And the very low value added labor intensive sectors that have low profit margins because there's more competition would be concentrated in China and Asia more broadly. And they wanted that relationship to stay permanently. That's why the U.S. agreed to allow this to happen in China. That's why the U.S. allowed China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001. And China actually had to make a lot of concessions that it didn't want to make to join the WTO. The U.S. believed that China was actually on the capitalist path, and that permanently, I often say the 3 T's. The U.S. wanted China to perpetually make cheap toasters, T-shirts, and toys for the US market, for US consumers, which was also a way of maintaining, because in the US, productivity has massively increased since the 70s, but wages have stagnated. And one of the ways that US consumers did not feel as poor is that they had very cheap consumer goods made in China and other parts of the global south. So their, TVs and computers and phones are cheaper than ever, but then healthcare and education and housing is more expensive than ever. So this was like, they wanted that system to stay permanently, that China would, in the division of labor, the US would design all of the iPhones and Apple would make 90% of the profits, and then 5% of the profits would go to like Foxconn, which is actually a Taiwanese company. A lot of people don't talk about that. So that like Chinese workers would get a very tiny, like China, Taiwan province is part of China, like they would get like 5% of the profits, right? And that 90% would go to the US in the form of these intellectual property monopolies. But obviously, China they did not tolerate that. I think this is like a very important point that people to really understand why China brought in that foreign investment. It was not, they needed the investment to understand how to develop this technology and move up the value chain, but their goal was always to move out of this trap. That's why uneven development and unequal exchange is possible. The reason that unequal exchange is possible is because you can pay much higher wage levels in the core, because you have these monopolized industries that no one else can challenge. Who's going to challenge Apple? Who's going to challenge Microsoft? Literally the only country that can is actually China.
Exactly right. Yeah. About the trade differentials that have been occurring between the states, you touched on it a little bit, but it's the fact that China has had this proactive process or effort to de-link from the United States and the general Western bloc, but specifically the United States. Meanwhile, the United States has not tried to do it nearly as much. Now, I mean, they're kind of picking up a bit more steam, but it's such a disjointed process because there is no central plan, there's no nationwide, there's no nationwide attempt to do it. And as a result, the bottlenecks exist across practically every industry in the States, including, funnily enough, defense and security. Other, like, you assume that they would manage to keep these sectors at least complete. Hugo flashes his China. Anyways, you'd imagine that they'd be able to keep at least these under wraps and under total American control from development down the chain, the commodity chain, until whatever product needs to be produced. But no, not even that. And as a result, and you touched on this right now, the effect of the silly trade war was just reducing quality of life for most Americans, and a lot of hot air politically, not resulting in anything meaningful. The question I want to have for you is, what do you think is going to happen after this 1 year, quote unquote, 1 year pause?
Yeah, it's really hard to predict. One, because in general, the U.S. is in a serious crisis, many crises. And it would be hard enough even if Joe Biden, the skeleton, were president. But with Trump, I mean, it's just like this guy, he could decide next week to start the trade war. I actually don't think he will this time, because I think he and Bessent recognized that actually they bit off way more than they could chew. They were in a very dangerous situation. And with the midterm elections coming up in 2026, they didn't want to, further destabilize the economy. So I think they're going to wait. And basically, I think the strategy of the Trump administration on China is to try to kick the can down the road and figure out a new strategy, which is just a new Cold War. I think at first they really thought they could just bully China and be very adversarial, very aggressive. Pete Hegseth, the alcoholic extremist, who's now the aptly named Secretary of War, who's also an end times fundamentalist, who wrote a book in 2020 called American Crusade, in which he literally said that the U.S. is in a holy war against China, the international left, and all of Islam, with nearly 2 billion Muslims. So, I mean, he's basically declaring war on almost half of the world. Brilliant. He wrote that book in 2020. It was not a long time ago, back when he was a Fox News host. Anyway, so they came in guns a-blazing, and Hegseth gave these crazy speeches saying they're preparing for war with China, including this crazy speech in Singapore. And I think they kind of recognized that they really overestimated how strong they are and underestimated how strong China is. And I think they're now kind of taking a step back and trying to figure out what the new strategy is. And right now it appears to be to impose U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and try to destabilize all independent governments in Latin America. So I think that's going to be their main focus, unfortunately, for right now. Mostly because they know that the US economy is so deeply embedded with China's economy that anytime they try to attack China, it's going to do more damage to the US than it does to China, precisely because of the issues we've been talking about. So, out of the own self-interest of the US capitalist class, they're kind of limited in what they can do, which is kind of a good thing, but at the same time, it's all they're doing is just delaying the inevitable, which is that their strategy is to try to force some kind of decoupling, as you discussed. And, I agree with what you said, but actually, I would not downplay the extent to which people in Washington are trying to make plans to decouple. Now, there certainly is no economic planning, but if there's one thing that Washington is decent at, it's kind of imperial planning for like the next, like foreign policy planning for the next wars, because they wage so many wars. That is one thing they do plan, right? Even though economically there's no planning. So like you said, like they're completely dependent on rare earths coming from China in order to make the weapons that they need to prepare for war on China. So they are trying to figure out that there's so much money going into all these consultants getting paid to like make PowerPoint presentations about how to make a new supply chain for critical minerals. But like that is something that they are actually, they are prioritizing that, and that's not going anywhere. So maybe in Trump's third term, because he's talking about that, they will have some kind of new plan. But like everything, I think just now what they're doing is just like taking one step back to try to think about ways to like move forward in the new Cold War, Cold War II. And fortunately, it's good that I think they're recognizing that a war with China, first of all, they would lose. There have been many reports that the Pentagon has done war games and they basically lose in every scenario. In the best case scenario with the war with China, they both lose, but they don't win in any scenario. The US doesn't win in any scenario. So I think they're just like, they're in this predicament where they have to figure out a way to kind of to try to decouple in order to prepare for more conflict with China, but they have to minimize the self-harm it causes. To concretely answer your question very briefly, I expect not the trade war will be paused, but I expect more sanctions on China, more Chinese companies added to the entity list, which is kind of a form of sanctions, more banning like Chinese scholars and the US scholars from working together, more banning Chinese technology in the US. Like that kind of stuff is going to continue, of course. There's no question.
Yeah, of course. My favorite part about the banning of these specialists or university educators or postdoc and PhD students and whatnot is that, funnily enough, a lot of these American specialists are Chinese origin. So when they start noticing all this racism, where do they end up going? They go right back to China, which is what's been happening. The quantum computing, I forget the name, I'm sorry to say, but he is basically like the father of modern quantum computing. Not that old either. He came to the States as a PhD student when he was in his 20s and has been living there for 30 years. And now, because of all this nonsense, he's like, nah, fuck it, I'm going back. And he got tenured in a Chinese university. He's continuing. And there's dozens of cases like this. It's hilarious. It's like when you see the are they called mathletes? These or other like educational or scientific competitions that are being held, and then you have like the several countries competing, and then you see like the Russian team are Russians, the Iranians are Iranians, the French are French, the Chinese are Chinese, and the American ones are all Chinese origin or like a mishmash of people of Indian heritage, Chinese heritage, and so on and so forth. It's just very interesting to know. Of course, it's a quote-unquote nation of immigrants and whatnot, but that Chinese aspect shouldn't be lost on people, that there will be a reverse brain drain in these upper levels the more tight the situation gets.
This is another aspect of imperialism that's not discussed a lot, which is this brain drain, which is devastating for many countries,
Absolutely.
especially socialist countries, because they spend all of this money on free education and healthcare and infrastructure, training these very skilled scientists and engineers, and then they all go to the US for their PhD and then they get a job thereafter. This is of course true for China, but even India doesn't have a socialist government, but India still spends all this money training these people, and they go work in the brightest people from India go to the US.
Yeah.
This is obviously this is bad for India. It's been bad for China, and now ironically it's reversing, which is good for China.
It's being bad for the States. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. America is going to be the king and prince of brain drain the second it loses its position as the economic hegemon, because I'm sorry to say, but financial quote-unquote stability and capitalist brands is the only thing keeping American patriotism alive. And the second they can no longer afford to participate in this pinnacle of American culture, let's call it, even less than they have access to now. I'm talking about regular Americans. Everything pinning them down to staying in the U.S. will dissipate, causing them to migrate far more than arguably any other nation ever has. That's my tiny prediction, because in other nations you have other either ideological or national principles keeping you there. Well, in the U.S. it's because I can buy big thing, pretty much. But we've taken far too much of your time. This has been absolutely fucking brilliant.
Yeah.
Your lovely partner needs to go back to watching YouTube. We need to save you for her from us. And I think today's conversation was absolutely brilliant. I have personally learned a lot about parts of the world that unfortunately I've not had as much access to learning enough about. Before we wrap up, Ben, please tell everyone where they can find your stuff. All of the links obviously will be included below.
Yeah, people can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com. All the links are there. And yeah, thank you for having me. I look forward to reuniting. We can all reunite in your cave in an undisclosed location somewhere in Central Europe.
Yes.
And yeah, we can chat more. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Genuinely was. Do you see this couch? It opens up. It's very big. It's not a casting couch. Wherever you want to visit my cave, you are, as I told you in China, you are very, very, very welcome to. I won't feed you frog, but we'll find something interesting. Yes,
I will feed you much better food, I promise you.
I'm gonna go and buy a few tracksuits. I need a tracksuit.
If it wasn't you, Ben, I would feel racially profiled. Speaking of profiling, ladies, gentlemen, and NBs of the Patreon, thank you very much for supporting us. If you are somebody considering supporting what we do here, please do check out the Patreon link below. Many tiers through which you get everything from exclusive episodes, personal hangout sessions with us, access to the wide Discord community, and arguably more show benefits than any other show out there. Every episode early and not one.
Count it.
Two times more than that. 2 exclusive episodes a month.
All right. With all that being said, this has been the Deprogram. I'm Hakeem.
I'm Yugopnik.
I'm Ben, and I hope to see you guys soon in our when we're being tortured at a CIA black site together.
Hey, let's go.
Deal.
Of course.